Good morning, Ray. Greetings from Geneva. Very happy to have you here. So,
Glad to be here.
I'm, one of the many people who read your books. I actually went to my paper library, and this is a book that came out in 1999 called "The Age of Spiritual Machines." So let me quickly introduce you, and then we move to our conversation. So Ray Kurzweil is one of the world's leading inventors, thinkers, and futurists. He has a 30-year track record of accurate predictions. He was the principal inventor of the first CCD flatbed scanner, the Omnifont optical character recognition, the first CCD flatbed scanner, the Omnifont optical character recognition, print-to-speech reading machine for the blind, text-to-speech synthesizer, music synthesizer, capable of recreating the grand piano and other orchestral instruments, and commercially marketed large vocabulary speech recognition software. You received the Grammy Award for Outstanding Achievements in Music Technology. You are the recipient of the National Medal of Technology in the United States, and you were inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. You hold 21 honorary doctorates and honors from 3 US presidents. You've written 5 national best-selling books, including The Singularity is Near. I think everyone associates the term singularity with you, Ray. And then in 2012, you wrote How to Create a Mind. Both were New York Times bestsellers. And then more recently, you wrote a book, Danielle, Chronicles of a Superheroine. And this was the winner of multiple young adult fiction awards. You are a principal researcher and AI visionary at Google, and looking at the long-term implications of technology and society. So you will be coming out with a book. It's announced for next year, and it's called The Singularity is Nearer. So your first book in 2005 was The Singularity is Near, and now you're coming out with a book called The Singularity is Nearer. And okay, so let's start. Actually, my first question refers to your suspenders. They're pretty colorful. Right.
Yeah, you don't see very many people wearing hand-painted suspenders anymore.
These are handmade, so these are hand-painted suspenders?
Yeah. A girl named Mel makes them, but I'm the only one who gets them. So.
Okay. Good, all right. Were you surprised by the capabilities of the large language models that came out in the last 7-8 months or so?
Well, no, I mean, this activity is a prelude to our passing the Turing test. We can talk more about what that means. But in the book you showed, The Age of Spiritual Machines, which came out in '99, I predicted that we would pass the Turing test by 2029. And Stanford was so alarmed at this that they actually held an international conference to talk about my prediction. And 80% of the AI experts that came from around the world agreed with me that a computer would pass the Turing test, but they didn't agree with 30 years, 2029. They thought it would take 100 years. This poll has actually been taken every year. So I've stayed with 2029, still believe that. AI experts started at 100 years. It stayed pretty much said, and lately it's come down. Now the consensus of AI experts around the world is also 2029. So people are agreeing that I was right. But prior to passing a Turing test, you're going to have things like large language models, which emulate human intelligence. There's a few ways that they're not correct. I mean, if you ask one of the popular social large language models, how many E's does the following sentence have? And then you put some sentence in quotes. It actually doesn't get that correct. And that's something that humans can do quite easily. However, you can ask it anything about topics in philosophy or physics or any other field, and it'll give you a very intelligent answer. So in many ways, they're better. I mean, even Einstein didn't understand issues in philosophy and psychology and so on. I mean, so it really has a very broad base, can articulate very quickly. They operate thousands of times faster than a human. So in many ways, it's superior. I mean, when a computer does something, it doesn't just do it at the levels of humans. Like when it played Go, it plays it far better than any human can possibly play it. In fact, Lee Sedol, who's the best human player of Go, said he's not going to play anymore because these machines are so fantastic. So one of the things in passing a Turing test is that you actually have to dumb it down, because if it showed its fantastic knowledge of every different field, you'd know it's a machine. So that's one of the things. But there's also a few things that humans can do easily that they can't quite do. But that's going to be overcome in the next few years. It'll probably be passed prior to 2029.
Okay. Can I ask the colleagues of my technical colleagues to crank up the volume a little bit? Because I have difficulty hearing a bit. Ray, you invented something for the blind, but not yet for the hearing impaired people. So I was asking my colleagues if they can do the volume a little bit louder. Okay.
Well, we do have speech recognition that's quite accurate. So you can speak,
Okay, yeah.
and you can actually get a transcription of what people are saying.
Actually, a colleague of mine said, you know, she was looking for captioning, and I don't see a captioning here, so yeah, that would help. Okay, good. So, I mean, could you, like half a year ago or so, or like a year ago, you couldn't, I mean, you could say if a machine wouldn't have passed the Turing test, you know, if I speak to a machine and I speak to a computer, I could have easily recognized after, I don't know, 15 minutes or maybe earlier or a bit later that this is a machine. Now you could actually argue I could still make the difference, but it's the human which is, the human responses which are not as great as the answers of the machine. Is that a fair statement?
Well, once a computer masters something, it doesn't just stop at a human level. It goes way past it. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's true for everything. So to pass the Turing test, it would have to be dumbed down. I think it's an important test that if it can actually do everything a human can do, particularly in language. There's another version of Turing test where it would actually have a virtual person who could actually speak and have facial expressions that match what it's talking about. But that's actually no more difficult than mastering human intelligence and language. But these large language models, this is not an alien invasion of intelligent machines coming from Mars. I mean, we create these machines to make ourselves smarter. And if somebody actually uses GPT-4 to write something, I mean, that is, I think, what human beings do. We use tools to make us smarter. And I mean, who here doesn't have their smartphone? Actually did that. 5 years ago, I would ask who here has a smartphone. Only a few hands went up. I did that recently. And like who here does not have their cell phone? Nobody raised their hand. So this is actually an extension. We're actually smarter with this than we would otherwise be. Now it's external. We might lose it. I think it'd be greater if we actually brought it into ourselves so we wouldn't forget it at home. But these things are going to make us smarter. And it's really the rise of intelligence. If you look at the broad scope of evolution on this planet, we're getting more and more intelligent. So 100,000 years ago, we had Homo sapiens, but they were not as smart as us. They didn't have the tools that we have today. So we basically are able to create tools that make us smarter and more capable of doing things that we need.
How do you see the future of large language models? So some people say, some scientists say, like in 5 years, they're maybe not that relevant anymore. How do you see that?
Well, large language models are actually going to go beyond just language. They're already bringing in pictures, videos, and so on. I'll just give you one application. If we apply it to medicine, we can actually simulate biology. And the Moderna vaccine was actually done this way. The Moderna vaccine was created in 2 days. The computer considered billions of different combinations of things that would fight COVID, including mRNA sequences. And it actually went through several billion of them. And it decided on one that was the best. And that was the vaccine. And that's the vaccine we use today. And it was done in 2 days. Now, they actually then went for 10 months to test it on humans, but that's also unnecessary. Rather than testing on 500 biological humans, we could test on 1 million simulated humans. That would be just as good. And, you know, you're much more likely to match one of those than the 500 that they use. And that could also be done in a few days. So rather than taking many years, like up to 10 years, to do these things with humans, we could do it on a computer in a matter of days. And that's where we're going, simulated biology. And some of the techniques that are used in large language models are used for that. And this is actually now the coming wave in medicine. We're going to make fantastic progress in the next few years.
Do you see anything where a computer will eventually not be better than a human being?
No, absolutely not. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, well, emotional intelligence, people have that, and that's more sophisticated than logical intelligence, which is true. But we use the same kind of connections to deal with emotional intelligence, to know how to react to someone else and get into their frame of mind. That just takes more intelligence. It's actually the best thing that we can do. But it is also using the same kinds of connections that we use to make any other decision. So they will have emotional intelligence, and they'll actually react to us. But just like humans, some humans are friendly to us, some humans are not friendly to us. So we have to be mindful of creating things that actually advance our goals. So that's a whole nother issue that we can talk about.
I mean, I read a book review that you wrote in the New York Times a few years back, and then if I may quote here, you said, "The superiority of human thinking lies in our ability to express a loving sentiment, to create and appreciate music, and to get a joke." These are all examples of emotional intelligence. But you're saying the machines, so I thought the humans have emotional intelligence, but machines don't, but you're saying machines will have emotional intelligence.
Yes, absolutely. But reading will make us to be better humans. As I said, it's not an alien invasion of intelligent machines to take us over. So people constantly look at the machines versus us as if they're two separate things. But it's not. I mean, look at how these things are used today. Everybody has a cell phone. Everybody's amplifying their intelligence already. And that's just going to continue. And it's going to become much closer to us.
Okay, so my smartphone is an extension of my brain. That's what you're saying. What would be the next step to enhance my...
Well, the next step is to make machines even more intelligent. And that's definitely happening. And it's at a very sharp increase right now in medicine and everything else, and also bringing it closer. So virtual reality is another way in which we're making it closer, but ultimately it'll go inside our brains. And that's a complicated issue, but it doesn't have to connect to the entire brain. It can just connect to the end of the neocortex. The neocortex is kind of organized in a pyramid. And as you go up the pyramid, it's dealing with more and more intelligent subjects. So you only really need to connect at the top level of this pyramid. So, and there's the things that are being experimented with that can do that today. They'll be useful for people who can't communicate, but ultimately it will enhance our own intelligence. And people say, well, I wouldn't want that. But I mean, who goes around without their cell phone today? People that thought at the beginning of cell phones, well, I don't really need that. But now everybody has one. And it will ultimately make us much smarter. These things are part of who human beings are, and we see that already, and that's going to continue.
Could you explain or give us some idea what this would look like? There might be invasive technologies that connect the electrodes inside the brain, maybe, and there might be some non-invasive
Well, I
technologies.
imagine we would take some kind of medication that would have nanobots that go through our bloodstream, and they would find the end of the neocortex and attach themselves there and communicate outside. So you could have then a computer on your body, but more likely really in the cloud, because an advantage of the cloud is it's duplicated. If you put something in the cloud, it's actually multiplied many, many times, and not just in one building. It actually goes through many different buildings. So you could blow up an entire cloud facility and nothing would be lost because the information is duplicated in other centers. So our extension of our brains, I mean, our brain has several actually trillion connections, and that's what gives us intelligence. They're very slow, though, operates at 200 calculations per second. Machines operate at billions of calculations per second. So it can be much, much faster and ultimately know a lot more, as we see with large language models even today. So ultimately, we'll be able to connect to that, and it'll be just part of our thinking. It's just another set of connections. But ultimately, that set of connections that we communicate with outside of our body will be much greater than what we can do in our brains. But that'll just be part of human intelligence.
Can you give a timeline for these scenarios?
Yeah, well, I said we'd pass the Turing test by 2029. I think might be earlier, but I'm sticking with that prediction. So there'll be like large language models. They'll know everything. They won't make sort of stupid mistakes, like they can't count the number of E's in a sentence that you give them. And they'll definitely, and then we'll be able to pass the Turing test by dumbing it down. But ultimately, that will actually give us knowledge of everything. No human being has that today, but it'll be part of our own intelligence. And there's still a whole veil of ignorance that we don't know about. So, I mean, just because if you know everything that humans know, it doesn't mean you know everything, because we haven't explored other areas. In the 2030s, we'll be actually merging with this intelligence. So rather than being outside our body, our brain will naturally just be extended. So rather than having a few trillion connections, we'll have thousands of trillions of connections and ultimately be much smarter. But that'll actually help us to explore knowledge that we don't know. And there's still a lot that we don't know.
Okay. Switching topics a little bit, a number or maybe quite a number of researchers and many people are afraid that AI might, let's just call it, take over the world. Could you describe a scenario how that might happen? I mean, today's language models, they can code, can code pretty well. You could, I guess, give access to them, maybe to your bank account, do things on the internet. So could you give maybe a scenario what it might look like if AI were really to control many things?
Well, I mean, large companies today, really all of them, putting out products in the public domain. They have large efforts to avoid hallucinations, which is inaccurate data, and generally follow socially and morally appropriate ways of conduct. But there are lots of public domain large language models out there that don't necessarily have these controls. It's just like people. I mean, most people actually will advance human intelligence in a positive way, but there's a few that don't do that. And we can't actually necessarily predict that. If you look back in history, I mean, take World War II, the Nazis might have won if they made different decisions. So it's not absolute. We could have bad players use these things to advance their goals. And so the future of human history is not set. I'm optimistic about it, and the singularity is nearer. I show 50 different graphs where everything we care about, child labor and health and 50 different things have actually been growing every year, every decade. And I believe that will continue. But we still have to be mindful of bad players using these kinds of technologies. And you can demonstrate they could do things in the future that we wouldn't be prepared for. So we actually have to beef up our defenses against that. But that's happening.
I'd like to dig a little bit deeper. Can you give a real world scenario of how that might work? So we have currently the large language models, and so how would that work? That AI would take over control?
Well, there's lots of scams right now where people use computers to create things that are inaccurate or socially inappropriate and put them out.
Okay.
And we have some defenses against that. But if you actually use a very intelligent large language model, it could do that much more sophisticatedly. And even some of the smaller ones, well, they're not as good as the large ones that the big companies have. 50% of their output could actually not be told from an innocent output. So we're going to have to beef up our defenses against that. One way of doing that is to identify who's putting things out. And if you notice that they're putting out things that are inaccurate and so on, then you wouldn't give them permission to influence other people. But that gets to be fairly complicated, but I think that's the direction we're going to go in.
Okay. So how seriously should we take this problem that researchers call alignment problem? Let's call it making sure that the robots don't do things that we don't want them to do. Researchers seem to get somewhat ridiculed who think this is a very serious problem, and other researchers say we should rather put our resources into known problems like disinformation, misinformation, disinformation, bias. So how serious should we take the problem that AI may go havoc?
Well, we should take it very seriously because these machines are coming. There's no way of avoiding that. Mm-hmm. We actually want responsible actors to have the most intelligence so they can combat misuse of the intelligence. I mean, there was a letter that went around that we should stop AI development for 6 months so we can figure out what's happening. That would be a very bad idea because the bad uses of these technologies would still advance, and then the responsible people would not have ways of combating it. Of course, that's not happening, but it's really different people have different ideas about what they want to do in the world, and some of them are bad actors, and we have to continue to combat that. And it's going to be on a very sharp increase in intelligence, both the good actors and the bad actors. I mean, I make the case in the singularity is near, despite all of these misuses of technology, everybody is better in terms of wealth, in terms of health, and 50 different things that I cite, despite the bad actors. So the history is actually pretty promising on this part.
We had Yuval Harari on the program yesterday, and he said that every company should be required to, say, invest 20% in safety research. And then I mentioned this to Stuart Russell today, and he reminded me that nuclear plants, they invest pretty much everything, like 99% into safety research. What do you think about making it a requirement for companies to put a certain amount of their money into safety research, and what amount would be a reasonable amount?
Well, for large companies that put out the best large language models, they're putting a very substantial, I'd say it's more than half, into safety, avoiding hallucinations, avoiding socially inappropriate comments, and making sure that they're used for proper purposes. So it's a huge amount of effort being done really by every large company, because they'll be liable if they don't do that. So it's not like we're not doing anything. I mean, these large language models are very heavily tested, but there are some large language models, not quite as big, being used by bad actors that are public domain, and they can be used to manipulate facts and so on. And that's going to be a problem. It's a problem today. But nonetheless, we're making progress, I think, in the overall quality of life of most people.
The open source language models are pretty powerful. And I guess you could argue a good thing about open source language models is they help democratize AI, so you don't depend on big tech, large language models. The downside of it, that it, as you say, it may fall into the wrong hands. Is there, seems like one have to square a circle. Is there a way out of it?
There's no way out of it. And I mean, a lot of predictions of the future take today's large language models and just assume nothing's going to happen. And that's been true at every different point. People assume that the current technology is just going to remain and ignore the fact that it's really on a very sharp increase. So large companies are already fighting to fight abuse of large language models, which is feasible, but can be combated. But that's not good. But 3 years from now, it's going to be a whole different type of technology, and you're going to have to reinvent it. And that's what we do with technology. It's just a lot faster now. When the railroad came, it completely displaced lots of jobs, and things were very dramatically different. But it took decades for that to happen. Now it happens in a matter of months. So it's very, very quick. But we also have tools to combat it. I'm optimistic, and I make that case with the history of technology, but it's going to be very, very fast.
Yeah. I mean, if you say it'll take time, I think it was maybe also Yuval Harari who made the point that the Industrial Revolution, also caused the Second World War, the World Wars, and so humanity made quite a number of mistakes, and I mean, we can't really afford that with AI. We have to get it right the first time.
But look at wars today. I mean, we get very upset, rightly so, at wars that kill hundreds, maybe thousands of people. But you go back, 80 years or something, to World War II, we had 50 million people die in wars in World War II, just in Europe, and many other places as well. We don't have wars like that anymore, because actually the weapons are more precise, and they don't have all the kinds of collateral damage that we did 80 years ago. So actually, you can look at the scale of war; it's actually going down. On the other hand, we still have lots of nuclear weapons. That's not really discussed very much. That could blow up everybody. That's not an AI technology. So we have to. So I mean, the future is not foretold. I mean, things could go wrong. But I make the case that even during World War II, things continued to go better. I mean, if you look at my graph, if we can put that up, this is a graph I created of the power of AI intelligence. Is it up? No. And so this is an exponential graph. So straight line means exponential growth, and it's 80 years of exponential growth. The first 40 of this, nobody was following this. So it's not like, well, we have to get to this level next year. Nobody knew that it was happening, and yet it nonetheless grew exponentially. So I started about 40 years ago. I created this graph, half of it, and then projected it out, and we're right on that track. The first one on there, it did 0.000007 calculations per second per dollar. The last one on here does 50 billion calculations per dollar. And that allows large language models. Large language models didn't exist until maybe a couple of years ago because we didn't have enough computation to do it. And this has a mind of its own. It's going to continue. And that's where all these advantages of computer technology come from. Actually started in World War II. The very first two computers there were done by a German, Zuse. He was not a Nazi, but it was presented to the Nazi government. They turned it down. They didn't see any advantage of computation. That was not important. The third one was Colossus, created by Turing and his colleagues. And that was taken very seriously by Churchill. And they actually then used it to decode all the Nazi messages. So every Nazi message that was sent, Churchill and his colleagues were able to read. And that accounted actually for the British to win the Battle of Britain, which otherwise they would not have won because they were outgunned, but they actually knew what the other people were doing. So there's lots of stories on this line, but this is what's driving computer technology. And this kind of exponential growth is not just true of computers, it's true of every type of technology.
Okay. What would be technological solutions to fight the disinformation problem?
Well, I mean, for one thing, we have search engines. I mean, if you look at the major search engines, Bing and Google search and so on, they're really very accurate. Most people abide by them. You can actually check all the facts put out by a large language model in a search engine, and that's actually being done. So that actually combats this type of misinformation that's put out. Now, again, people on their own can do something different, and they can actually purposely put out something that certain vaccines don't work and you'd be terrible to use them. So we can't control everything. And it's actually a good thing that these are decentralized, so you're not giving too much power to large companies. But they do actually use technology we have already, which is pretty good at identifying falsehood from truth.
Can you give some details? Can you give some details?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into comparing one company against another, but all these major companies, Microsoft, Google, and so on, use their own search engines to actually check what the large language models are checking. And I mean, I've used them now many thousands of times. I've never seen anything that's inaccurate. However, I'm not the only person. Hundreds of millions of people and ultimately billions of people will be using this. And if you go over the whole thing, sometimes it's going to say something that's inaccurate. And then that gets promoted virally and people get very upset about it. But it's really actually pretty accurate. So I think it's a manageable problem, at least by the big company large language models.
Okay. Switching topics again a bit, a big topic, not just at this conference, but overall is the topic of AI governance and perhaps international AI governance. What are your thoughts? I mean, there have been frameworks around for many years, hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, and they all sound pretty similar. What would, let's get a level deeper. What would be good regulatory requirements?
Well, the Asilomar conference, which was decades ago on biotech, has served to be pretty good at avoiding problems with biotech. You can certainly create something in biologically that could kill people and so on, and yet we haven't seen that. And most of the things that are coming out are positive for humanity. So there actually was a Asilomar conference at the same place on AI ethics. And we came up with some things there. It requires judgment to actually implement them. But the fact is, it's not the case that there's no AI regulation. For example, one case is to create medical ethics so that we can actually make very rapid progress in overcoming cancer and other diseases using simulated biology. But you can't say there's no regulation in medicine. I mean, even if you use AI, and everything's going to be using AI, there's tremendous amount of regulation. In fact, I think it's too strong. I know people who could have used a drug and they weren't able to get it. And then 6 months after they died, that drug became available and could help them. So I think, if anything, regulation is too strict, but there's definitely regulation in that area. And in fact, there's regulation in every area. I mean, the amount of regulations goes on for hundreds of thousands of pages of regulation that people have to follow. And so we don't just put out a product. It goes into, it's just filled with all kinds of liabilities and so on, and people really take that seriously. And that's really where the regulation comes from. I mean, these products don't just go out in the world. They're used in other areas which have tremendous amount of regulation.
What about requiring large language models to undergo a safety check before they are deployed? There was this open letter or open letters, maybe to put a moratorium on the development of large language models, but I guess that's just not practical. Development, you don't stop development, but you could stop, or you could put requirements on the deployment. So you distinguish development from deployment. You could ask a company to run certain safety checks before they actually deploy a model.
Well, they absolutely do that. I mean, they don't put these things out without checking it. I mean, I think if they had a tremendous amount of false information and information that would be inappropriate and telling people who are considering suicide, well, why don't you try that? Which actually happened once, but didn't happen again. So there's a tremendous amount of checking these things before they go out. But at least that's true of large companies. There are things where people actually change them to put out false information that they believe. So we see that today. There's a constant battle between people who misuse these things. And that's not going to go away. And that's why we don't want to stop it, because we use very intelligent language models to combat the abuse with smaller language models that common people might have and put out to influence people in a negative way. And if we stop the development, we won't actually have those larger language models to help us. And anyway, it's useless. I mean, people in Iran or China will continue to develop them. Nobody's going to follow not developing these things. We actually need more intelligent weapons on the side of truth and so on.
Okay, let me switch again some of the topic. What would you recommend young people who finish high school and who would like to go to college? What would you recommend that they study?
Right. Well, it's actually kind of an old-fashioned advice, which is to find something that you have a passion for. So whether it's music or art or science or physics or psychology and so on, really get into that and appreciate what's good and bad about it. And then as we have more powerful tools, we'll actually make more progress, and you can appreciate that. But I wouldn't say go for coding, for example, because coding ultimately will be overcome by machines. I mean, already something like a third of the code that's produced is already created by machines, and that's only going to increase. But you have to appreciate what we can do with this, and we'll ultimately have more tools to advance that. So find your passion. Some people have multiple passions. My father had one passion, which was music. My mother was a great artist. And that's really what you should try to do.
I'm trying to challenge you on this advice. I read an article, I think it was also in New York Times a few weeks ago, where the author said, it was an opinion piece, that following your heart is not necessarily the best advice, because the problem with following your passion or your heart is that you may fall back into cultural assigned roles. So, maybe women may not necessarily think of going into physics, but so they might go into roles like psychology or the social sciences, because that's what sort of culturally it's expected of them. So they said it's actually not good advice not necessarily good advice to follow your heart.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that. If your heart is in it, you're likely to do more creative work and appreciate it more. And the idea of people choosing something that's really not something they care about because they think society will reward efforts in that area, I don't think it's good advice. Because the tools to create more intelligent technology in every single thing we do is going to increase. And there's not such thing as taking a safe view. We will have a lot more money. I show that in the book. There's actually a straight line that shows the increase in the amount of money we have. So I think people will be okay, even if they choose the wrong thing, because it's going to be a lot of money. In fact, today already, there's a lot of social safety programs, which we didn't have 100 years ago. The very first safety program, say in the United States, was Social Security, which happened in the 1930s. So 90 years ago, that was the very first thing. There was actually nothing from the government that would help you. Now there's a lot of programs. It's not perfect. I think by the time we get to 2030s, we'll have something like residual income for people that need it, because we'll be able to afford that.
If you could design the curriculum for high school students, how would you design it? Would you redesign it? What's currently being taught?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of education in general hasn't changed much in 100 years. And a lot of it is actually memorizing rote things. If you want to study history and you actually get into history of warfare and so on, people learn certain facts, but it doesn't really, they don't care about them because they just have to learn it to pass the test. Ultimately, if people really care about what they're studying, they'll advance it because they have a passion for it. So, I mean, there's been attempts. Montessori actually has a pretty good way of finding out what turns them on and teaching them that. I think we need to really focus on the human brain. And even at childhood, the human brains are going to be amplified already by technology. I mean, I come over and visit my grandchildren, that's 3, 9, and 11 years old, and they're all on their computers and they're all having a good time. It's actually advancing their education. So I would try to find out what people care about and learn that.
Okay. One last question. Could you give us a prediction that we could verify or falsify for the next, take your pick, 2 or 3 years? What is it that you foresee?
Well, if you follow, for example, large language models, which I think is the best example of AI, they're already quite remarkable. You can have a very intelligent discussion with them about anything. So nobody on this planet, Einstein, Freud, and so on, could do that. They might know something about their own field, but it's actually pretty remarkable. And this is being advanced such that every month it gets better and better. 3 years from now, these things will be quite exciting. I'm saying 2029, that's 6 years from now. I think passing the Turing test will happen sooner. Turing test really measures kind of a human level of activity. These circuits actually operate at billions of calculations per second, whereas our connections in our brain I mean, we have trillions of these connections, and that gives us some intelligence, but they operate at 200 calculations per second. So obviously these machines can be much faster and so on. But again, it's not us versus the machines. We create these machines to make ourselves smarter, and we already connect with them. Generally, the connections is outside of ourselves, but it's still part of who we are. And ultimately, it'll go inside our brain. It'll be part of who we are. Ultimately, most of the connections that we use will be outside ourselves. The cloud is useful because it actually is backed up. So it's not actually subject to warfare. You could blow up an entire building and all the information would still be there because it's separated among different places. And that's even going to get greater in the years ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Ray. We're at the end of our interview, so I will be looking forward. I think we'll be looking forward to the publication of your book. It's called The Singularity is Nearer, and coming out next year. So maybe we have you on our event again next year. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, John.